Spectrum wants to hear your views. You can SMS at any time during the show. Type Spectrum, leave a space, type in your contribution and name, then send it to 7197. Your views, our interviews on Spectrum, Radio 1 FM 90.
A very warm welcome. This is Spectrum on Radio 1. I'm your host, Edmond Kizito. On Spectrum tonight, making a case for a specific law on torture. How bad is the situation to justify such a law? Human rights activists are renewing their demand for Parliament to urgently enact a law to specifically address the high rate of torture in Uganda today. The activists argue that many perpetrators of torture and other forms of degrading mistreatment are walking scot-free while transferring the burden to the Ugandan taxpayer or even the victims themselves who eventually meet the cost of compensation. Torture remains a key challenge in Uganda today, and according to the 2010 report by the Uganda Human Rights Commission, torture ranked highest among the top 5 complaints registered. The Ugandan police force comprised the highest number of respondents with 36% of the complaints, followed by private individuals who took 27%, the Ugandan People's Defense Forces with 10%, and finally the disbanded Rapid Response Unit with 6%. There are fears that torture cases are likely to go up due to the post-2011 election activities, including the walk-to-work protests, and the ongoing confrontation between police and the opposition. Human rights activists say that torture is used as a tool of interrogation, causing many people to confess to crimes that they never committed or to even give evidence against others. Ndura West MP Wilfred Niwagaba drafted and tabled a private members bill entitled the Prohibition and Prevention of Torture Bill 2010, which was read for the first time and committed to the appropriate committee of Parliament before the 8th Parliament's term expired. So tonight, we will try to understand why a specific law on torture is needed and what it will take to have such a law in Uganda. Our guests tonight, Miss Ruth Sekidi, Director Complaints, Investigations and Legal Services at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. You're most welcome, Madam Ruth Sekidi.
Thank you. Good evening, viewers.
Viewers, because we're also on the internet, you can access a video of Spectrum off YouTube or the Radio 1 website, that is radio1fm90.com. We also are joined by Mr. Assistant Superintendent of Police Anatoli Muleterwa, Community Liaison Officer from the Kampala Metropolitan Police. You're most welcome, Mr. Muleterwa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Good evening, listeners.
This is Miss Barbra Nambi. Miss Nambi is the Program Coordinator at Program Coordinator in charge of Access to Justice at the AVOCATs Sans Frontier. That's the Lawyers Without Borders NGO. You're most welcome, Madam Nambi.
Thank you. Good evening, listeners and viewers.
Perhaps, Ruth, you can begin by telling us about this report which your agency put out. It says that torture was the highest complaint, but the situation is getting better now because complaints are now just about 12%. Is that good enough?
It is not good enough. It is better than nothing. If you look at our 2010 annual report, you realize that the highest violation, human rights violation in Uganda, is torture. So the Commission, together with civil society, have been tracking torture records, and we have been documenting them and realize that the problem is getting worse, and when it reduces, it doesn't reduce as much as we would hope so. So we have been doing a lot of activities, sensitization, but the program is still persistent. So that explains why we think that there is need for us to have a torture bill or a torture law in Uganda to curb the torture atrocities or activities in the country and to protect the citizens of Uganda.
All right, we'll talk about the details of those. But first of all, the disciplined forces are the ones that are turning out to be more indisciplined. Police, the army. Why?
You see, it so happens that police, the UPDF, ROU, and other security agencies are the biggest perpetrator of torture. But this comes about because they torture people in a bid to obtain information or confessions for them for crimes. They do it as a way of punishment. Prisons, police, the military, they do it as a form of punishment. They do it as for obtaining information or confessions. They do it for intimidation purposes. They do it for so many other reasons best known to them. So they do it for a purpose, and they're usually dealing with suspects. And usually it is to extract confessions. So I think that is the biggest reason why it is possible.
Well, Mr. Muleterwa, talk to us. Why do you do these things in the police force?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and our listeners out there. It is not true that we do this as an official policy. That may be an individual preference, but it is not an official policy. That as the force, we need to extort information or evidence or any kind of cooperation from the wananchi through torture. Remember, all the conventions, like you talk about the Convention Against Torture, African Human Rights Charter, including our own constitution, Article 44 is very clear about this. Therefore, this may be an issue of individuals who may wish to practice it by use of their personal authority, but not that it is an institutional policy. However, as an organization that is entirely accountable to the people, we cause kind of actions against the individual perpetrators who tend to exhibit that kind of behavior. We indeed work closely with our partners like the Uganda Human Rights Commission, other agencies, because we are all enjoined in jails where we are able
the
to
Justice Law and Order System.
Yes, through which we are able to benchmark and secret how do we really become an accountable organization through CCC, that is the coordination, communication, and there are three. So we tend to always share our challenges when we are when we meet in that joint organization. So per se, that the Uganda Police Force may wish to extort information from a suspect by use of such non-conventional means is not.
It's not official policy.
It is not official policy. But you see, I wish really to widen this debate by looking at our perspective. You know, when I grew up, or when I was still at school, there was that belief that an African child's ears
were in his past.
Yes. So that kind of phenomenon, if one really grew up with that kind of background and joins the force, do you expect him to change much? Because there is that kind of behavior, means there is that kind of attitude.
Well, is it true, is it not?
What is that?
That statement you just made.
But I do not practice it on my children. Why really? I don't.
But Mr. Muleterwa, let's get it straight here.
Yes.
You have a suspect, maybe a hardcore criminal. You want him to give information. You give him chocolate, and then he begins to talk to you. Right?
It is not chocolate. You mean by beating him, you'll get more faster information?
Well, it's not going to be easier.
No.
Save himself from further punishment.
It all depends on your witness. You know, in teaching there is that kind of witness. What kind of rapport have you caused to?
You make him your friend.
Definitely. Those are. Now, one time, you know, I had a moment of going outside Uganda.
Yes.
And I toured some of the detention centers of some of those countries and explored avenues through which those people were able to get cooperation from the suspects. You see, there is that, as I brought it, there is that cultural underpinning in our mind.
Yes.
That unless you kind of torture a suspect, then you may not get his cooperation. But you know, what I realized from where I went, if you are a detective, the best friend you can ever be able to get closer to
is a criminal.
Why? Like even the Bible. The other time you told me that I become a preacher, but I'm not a preacher.
God.
But I always really quote some of the good versions there.
Quote the Bible tonight.
Jesus never came for the righteous.
Yes.
He came for
the sinners.
And that's equally so, our bill there is for those who commit a crime or are in conflict with the law, and how we can really make them upright people to serve this society.
Well, Jesus actually at one time used the stick in church. Listeners, this is
And a
Spectrum
stick
on
and a
Radio.
carrot, not a stick alone.
Right, well, this is Spectrum on Radio, and tonight making a case for a specific law on torture. How bad is the situation to justify such a law? Our guests, Ms. Ruth Sekidi, Director Complaints, Investigations and Legal Services at the Uganda Human Rights Commission, Assistant Superintendent of Police Anatoli Muleterwa, Community Liaison Officer, Kampala Metropolitan Police, and Ms. Barbra Nambi, Project Coordinator, Access to Justice at the AVOCATs Frontier. You'll be able to contribute to this discussion at some stage. Barbra, give us some context of this. You come from AVOCATs Frontier. The imagination is that you collect, this international body, you collect case studies from different places. Give us some practices from other places. What happens? Is it the same trend that we see here, or is it Uganda a bad bin?
Uganda is not exactly a bad bin. Currently, given the situation in Uganda, yes, Uganda is just one of those African countries that is struggling with the issue of torture. And our MPs were able to send the members of parliament to do some benchmark visits in Burundi and the Philippines. Originally, as the Coalition Against Torture, we thought would look around for the closest countries that have legal frameworks that we could borrow from in Africa. But we only found that Burundi had a law on prohibiting torture. So that shows you that in actually Africa, Uganda is progressively trying to curb the vice of torture, and probably that civil society and the Uganda Human Rights Commission are really trying to make sure that we have a legal framework to help us prevent the acts. In the Philippines, where the members of parliament went, yes, it's a country that also has a legal framework. It has a law that prohibits torture. So in the context, we're able to compare those two jurisprudences to inform our bill and for our members of parliament to make a decision on whether we need a law or not, or we can probably our legal framework is enough to curb the acts of torture. So really, in the at the national and at the regional level, I think that the issue of torture is an issue. It's an international issue. It's a regional issue. And Uganda as a country, we are progressively trying to fight it in our own acts as civil societies. That's why there were awareness programs on this. The Uganda Human Rights Commission also does educate people specifically on torture. So it's a subject which we are trying to create awareness on for people to know it, because it happens because people do not know that actually it's a wrong.
Well, but do we really need this bill, the law? You just said we're not that badly off. Other people do it.
Other people do it does not justify the acts.
Yep.
But we do need a law, as our brother, Mr. Anatoli, said, that we need an accountability mechanism, probably because ignorance lets some vices grow in society.
Yes.
But now it has come, since Uganda ratified the Convention Against Torture and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we know that torture is freedom of from torture, cruel and human and degrading treatment.
Yes.
Is a human right. So the society needs to be protected and against people who can actually commit those acts. Now, when we are saying people, our focus is not only on the police.
Yes.
We are also saying that even people in our private capacities, individuals, do torture.
I heard of a man who slapped his driver. I thought that was ridiculous. Two men grown up and fighting on the streets. Go on. Yes?
Yes.
So it's not supposed to be. All right.
That is an assault.
Should I get up at the police station?
Yeah, probably that is an assault, but torture is unique.
Right.
It's distinct, and that is why we are coming up with a law. We are advocating for a law to give it the importance, to give it the meaning that it deserves in society.
Okay, Ruth, what is this law going to change? And as you explained that, you can give us some details. What would happen?
One, we have to know that torture is an absolute right. The freedom from torture is an absolute right. There can never be any justification or any circumstances under which you can be justified for torturing anyone.
Yes.
At any place.
And you can also give us the types of torture.
So the definition of torture is any act by which severe pain or suffering is intentionally inflicted on someone for purposes of obtaining information, for purposes of punishment, for purposes, right now it is against public officials. So this bill seeks to widen that definition, because when you look at the international definition under the United Nations Convention Against Torture, it limits torture to public officials.
Yes.
And that is why if you look at statistics, it simply shows the police, the prisons, UPDF. But then we've realized that there are circumstances under which private individuals can actually torture. What about armed rebels or armed groups like Joseph Kony?
Yes.
His acts would not be captured under the law that we use, the international law that we use,
yes.
If we go by the strict interpretation. So we opted to widen the definition to capture such incidences. For example, there's a man who beat up his worker and held him upside down in his house.
Oh.
And every day for a week he's beating him up, he's denied him food, he's doing all sorts of unbelievable acts against him. And that would not amount to torture ordinarily under the strict interpretation of this law, of the previous law. So
under the current law,
yes.
Such a man you cannot jail him.
No, he would only go for assault or causing grievous bodily harm.
Not torture, right?
But then when you look at the atrocity, it would actually be torture. So that is why we're trying to widen the definition of torture. And we are saying this law is very important because it will create accountability, and it also creates a deterrent mechanism against public officers, because they will be individually liable and held accountable. What is happening right now is that if a police officer or Anatoli, God forbid, tortures someone, he doesn't even know that proceedings are going on, and then at the end of the day taxpayers pay for this, for his actions, because the Attorney General presents him and the state pays on his behalf because he's acting in his vicarious capacity.
Right.
So we're saying, okay, this law will will lead individuals or perpetrators to feel the pinch.
Right.
Two, we're saying with this law, institutions will also be held accountable. We're also saying that this law will help us domesticate the UN CAT, the United Nations Convention Against Torture.
Yes.
So this law will help us domesticate these international instruments that we have ratified. And then it will help a mechanism of protecting people in custody. Now, when they're in custody, usually they don't have anyone.
People in jail,
yes,
they'll be
inmates.
protected. They won't be able to be tortured.
Yes. So it is a way of protecting inmates and protecting everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like a good law already, from where I'm seated. But let's look at other forms of torture, psychological torture. A man gets a wife, takes her home, after the wedding says you slash your hair even though it was plaited before. Is that torture or is it not?
We have to, like my colleague Barbra has said, we have to draw a line between torture and
psychological torture. There are other forms of torture.
Yes,
Children don't watch cartoons. Children cannot play in the home setting, for instance, at school, different environments, in boarding school. Give us some bit on the psychological side of it.
Psychological torture, I'll give examples of psychological torture. We've received cases, and I will not state the cases, but we have documented some of this, is when you're told that your wife is being killed, so you give us this information, and then you hear, recordings of your wife crying, and your children screaming, and so you're psychologically affected. So it creates traumatization. People will, you don't have any injuries on your
Right.
body. The victim has no injuries, but psychologically he is affected.
So psychological torture is going to be catered for as well.
Yes,
You
but
will-
then
you will
we'll
define
need
it?
medical experts to prove.
Someone tortured psychologically?
Yeah, that this person has been tortured psychologically.
You marry a woman, you incarcerate her in a home, she can't go out, she can't see her friends. Is that psychological torture, or are
Is
you
that
exercising
torture?
the authority?
The question is it torture at all? Because there are other crimes or there are other violations that would not amount to torture. For
Well,
example,
Barbra, talk to us about that, domestic violence.
Domestic violence. I think I will take this opportunity to explain to the viewers and the listeners the definition of torture. Torture, as Ruth had said, there is severe pain and suffering.
Yes.
It's either mental or physical.
Yes.
And that's where your psychological bit is captured. But then we go to the purpose for which it's committed.
Yes.
To make it torture. One, it's to extract information.
Well, but in the home, it's not necessary to extract information. A man could deny, could marry a woman, then goes away for 3 years, for instance. Is that not torture?
Yes, so that is why for us, no, it's not torture.
All right.
For it to qualify to be torture, the ingredients have to be fulfilled, including the purpose for which the act is committed.
It has to be quantifiable.
It has to be
All right.
holistic.
I'd like us to talk about compensation again under the law at the moment. But before we do that, Mr. Muleterwa, how are you going to do it? How will you define for us exactly if this bill comes into place? How will you be able to get statements from these people? Some of them are hardcore criminals, and we know that in the US, for instance, they have different ways of doing it. For waterboarding is one of them, controversial, but they use some kind of force to get statements out of these people. How will you do it?
As a trained police officer, there are various ways through which one can be able to extract information from a suspect. But the most effective one being friendly to the person. He will open up. As long as you open up with the person and tell him what he or she must be able to tell you, or if not, what will happen or what will be able to undergo, especially in terms of legal proceedings.
Yes.
Some people
will
tend
confess.
they give in very fast.
Right.
Some of our people here, they are not as hard as you may think.
Right.
It only depends on the mechanism through which you have approached one.
Right.
And that high-handedness
could be counterproductive.
It's very, very counterproductive.
Right.
Because by the way people think about it, because they even say, when I tell you,
you'll still bet.
You simply say, I've not told you the truth. I better become
silent.
So what we really need to do is being very professional, being very friendly, and you take a moment of bringing this person closer to you by giving him a kind of story. You soothe him.
Right.
Soothe him so that he or she can be able to appreciate that indeed
they can take you in confidence.
Yes, by the way, confidence building in a suspect is very important.
Right.
Don't just appear a terrorist before somebody. By the moment he sees you, he sees the brute in you. Let him see that element
of humanity.
That behind a police officer talking to him or her is a human being, and you realize that person really confides in you.
All right.
Not all those who have taken to court and prosecuted, we have relied on this. But like I've told you, these are individual preferences for which individuals, like my sisters have said, must stand accountable.
This is Spectrum. We're going for a break. We'll be back. We'll hear more from you, Mr. Muleterwa. Do stay tuned.
Back to school, Nido is giving you the ultimate send-off. For every tin of Nido 400 grams you buy, you get a free mug. Now you can enjoy Nido right from a mug of your own. Rush down to the nearest supermarket and get a tin of Nido 400 grams with a free mug and enjoy the new term.
John, Mike and I will go back a bit. We knew John at the beginning, working for someone else. But he was different. He had vision, saw opportunities. He started working towards his goal, opened his own garage, and worked, learning the hard way. His reputation spread. Trust, consistency, quality. Soon people were coming to him from all parts. He made himself and his whole street prosper, and also help friends, seeing potential in people and helping them on. But John never shouts about all his success. He's just who he is. Special.
So here's to one like John, who make a difference, who enjoy Nile Special, the rich, satisfying taste from the source. Nile Special.
You've earned it.
Not for sale to persons under 18.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90 is brought to you by Stanbic Bank.
Welcome back on Spectrum tonight, making a case for a specific law on torture. How bad is the situation to justify such a law? Our guests, Miss Ruth Sekidi, Director, Complaints, Investigations and Legal Services at the Uganda Human Rights Commission, Miss Assistant Superintendent of Police Anatoli Muleterwa, Community Liaison Officer at the Kampala Metropolitan Police, and Miss Barbra Nambi, Project Coordinator, Access to Justice in the Central Region from AVOCATs Sans Frontier. That's the group, the Lawyers Without Borders. It's an international advocacy group. Talk to us, Ruth, about compensation. When someone is tortured by the forces, what happens if they need to seek redress? They probably have lost capacity. They've suffered a grievous pain. They've lost maybe capacity to work. How do they do it?
When someone approaches the Uganda Human Rights Commission and alleges that there is torture, we investigate. We obtain medical evidence and all the evidence that we can find. And if we can prove, it is proved that there is a likelihood that torture actually occurred, then we send the matter to our tribunal for hearing. And usually, because the perpetrators, the police officers, the military, or whoever, in most cases, like I have previously said, they're state agencies. So they are represented in that capacity by the Attorney General. Because of
the individual doesn't show up.
So the individual doesn't show up unless the Attorney General decides to bring them as witnesses.
So in the end, it's the government that pays.
So in the end, it is the government that pays.
So what's the motive? What is the incentive for this person to stop doing it?
That's exactly what we are saying, that there's no accountability, so the perpetrator does not feel the pinch because he doesn't go to prison usually, though sometimes we write and recommend for disciplinary action or for prosecution of this individual, but usually the state pays. It is you and I who pay for his acts. Yes. And that is one of the rationale, the reasons why we think this bill is long overdue. We need it. In the same vein, I think it is important to note that we have tried to do a joinder where you join the individual.
Yes.
So it is Attorney General and that particular person, the perpetrator. But then you realize they're transferred, they get lost, they disappear. So somehow it is also very yes. And so I think this law is important because then they'll be individually held accountable. And the Commission is also handling these matters because to make sure that individuals are compensated, and I've said though it's the state that pays, we try to follow up and make sure that the victims are paid, because usually they get permanent incapacities or they lose livelihoods, they cannot work anymore, they cannot stand for long hours. So we try to help them follow up. And the courts are not handling torture cases because there's no law.
Yes.
There's no law that specifically, there's no criminal law. That specifically handles.
So they can get away with it.
Yes, so they get away with it. The courts are not handling it. And what the Uganda Human Rights Commission is using is an international law. And we are saying Uganda ratified the United Nations Convention Against Torture, so we are bound by this international law. So that is what we use to get the perpetrators.
Okay.
But in our domestic law, we have not domesticated this international instrument. Right. And that is why this law is important, to domesticate the cat and to be able to go after the perpetrators.
All right. Barbra, could you talk to us a little bit about the difference between the current law? Give us some more detail there. The difference between the current law and this new bill, this new law that is being proposed.
Yes, we do have a legal framework that mentions torture. We do have torture is mentioned in different legal frameworks, such as the Police Act, when the sections 25 clause 4, it mentions about torture. When someone is tortured in custody and so on, the magistrate has the responsibility to investigate, cause an investigation in the acts. Our constitution does mention it under Article 24.
Yes.
It says any person shall not be subjected to any forms of torture or cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment.
Yes.
The Uganda People's Defense Forces Act also has a provision on torture, but regulating the people within the force. The Anti-Terrorism Act, the Evidence Act also talks about that evidence that is extracted by force or by duress or by coercion should not be admitted in court. Yeah. And then the Prisons Act also has a prohibition on torture.
Yes.
And then other related for example, like under the penal code,
yes,
the issues of assault, grievous bodily harm, and so on. Someone would say that in case the acts of torture could be could categorically fall under those clauses under the penal code.
Yeah.
However, these laws do not define torture. They do not tell us what torture is.
Right.
So this is one of the positive aspects of this bill. It's going to define torture for us. And then torture itself is not a crime, irrespective of the fact that the different legal frameworks do mention it.
Torture is not a crime under the current law.
No.
You can torture someone and get away with it. You would not have broken a law.
They can reduce it, they can say it's assault, but torture, as in torture itself, is not a crime under our penal code.
What kind of sentences will courts hand out with this new law if it comes into place?
The new law we have different categories. We have aggravated torture. That one carries a penalty. It's a life imprisonment.
You could go to jail for life?
Yes.
For torturing another person?
Yes. And then 15 years for torture itself, which is not aggravated.
Yes, ordinary torture.
And then, yes.
So it's a serious thing?
It's a very serious.
People doing that better think about it again?
Yes, because of the effects that it leaves on the person, on the individuals, because of the effect it has on the state, and then it's a violation of human rights.
A violation of human rights. I would like, of course, to hear from you, Ruth, about the prevalence of some of these cases. But maybe before we do that, Assistant Superintendent of Police, Mr. Muleterwa, the training of the armed forces, the general impression, and it could be totally wrong, is that they are trained to prepare to extract information using torture methods. So tell us about what exactly happens in the training colleges for the army, police, and the prisons.
I'll particularly talk in the case of police. Conscious of our role as being the lead agency in the implementation of all laws, we undergo training, study on the various legal instruments, like my sisters here have mentioned them. What we really need to make categorically clear here that while we undergo this training, there is also a great emphasis on human rights, observation of human rights, and how really one needs to treat a suspect, be it in detention or as you are conveying him or her on the police station.
Yes.
And one of the sections within the Police Act is treating people with humane.
Right.
Therefore, this is all what is taught in training. But like I've told you, nobody teaches you to be rude. But sometimes you pick it up. So some of these people who tend to do whatever they do is not because it's an institutional policy.
Either the dining table where I grew up from or something.
But probably, yeah. So what we really need to stand up all together is to really support each other and put the perpetrators to accountability. And more so, to make the public very, very vigilant. You see, what people always there outside there tend to fear they think that we are their bosses.
Yes.
No, we are not.
Oh, really?
No, we are your servants.
Oh, even in police uniform?
Yes, we are there.
With the cops on your shoulders.
You see.
Let's hear it again.
Yes, the police motto is to protect and serve. We are there to serve you.
Protect and then serve.
Yes. Therefore, this element where some individuals tend to pick on bossism is not a policy.
Right.
It's not a policy. So, in our training, especially for those both in general duties and the CIDs, we are given a general information on investigative tips vis-a-vis interrogation.
Yes.
You know, interrogation is that element where you can bring in that bullism. Yes. But investigation, you are able to move from your office and go to the locus.
Yes.
And establish
the
really.
Yes.
You establish really what took place. You are sharing with the people there and get the real picture of what happened there. Therefore, we really